Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And in making sense of the world, a key art form for Christians is applying scripture to current realities. Now, I say art form because there is no scientific formula for taking a text that is thousands of years old and drawing an immediate, direct, clear connection to the current day. It is an art form that takes wisdom and discernment and often the help of thoughtful leaders. And that's why I wanted to talk to a friend who is just such a thoughtful leader for myself and for many people, Andy Crouch. Andy Crouch is a recurring contributor to Good Faith, and he's also a partner in theology and culture, figuring out how those two things connect to one another for Praxis, which is an important network of social entrepreneurs who are doing just that, trying to take scripture and live it out in the enterprises that they build. And as I've heard Andy teach in recent years, I've sensed that he is gravitating towards a particular book in scripture. And so I really wanted to hear from him. Andy, welcome back to Good Faith.
Thank you, Curtis. It is always fun to get to talk.
All right. Well, let's cut to the chase. What is this book of scripture that you've been gravitating around?
Well, let me give you just a tiny bit of background, which is at Praxis, we talk about the aim we're heading towards as redemptive entrepreneurship. We're trying to form entrepreneurs in every sector, for-profit, nonprofit, who think redemptively. So that raises a very important question, which is, what do we mean by that word redemptive? And a few years ago, as we were thinking about how to kind of unpack that word for our community, which is a theological task. I'm partner for theology and culture, so part of my job is to try to sort of do, well, not by myself, but try to be part of the theological work that we do. It occurred to me that if you asked Jesus of Nazareth, the rabbi, to tell a story of something redemptive, to tell a story of redemption. Now, see, if you ask Christians to do that, we're going to tell you the story of Jesus, because Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and ascension and eventual return are the great redemptive story of history, right? So Christians have a story to tell about Jesus, but what story would Jesus have told? Like when he was, say, 28 years old. Let's say he hasn't started his public ministry yet. He has, however, absorbed all of the Hebrew scriptures, and he's a faithful, student of them and already living them out. What story would he tell from his biblical tradition that would be kind of the paradigmatic redemptive story? And I realized I was absolutely sure I knew the answer.
Wow.
So, I hope I don't get to, heaven and realize I made a mistake here. But I am positive he would tell you the story of the Book of Ruth. Because the Book of Ruth is, among other things, the most remarkable story of redemptive action in the original sense of that word, which means to buy someone or something back, often at a high price, from someone or something that has lost their freedom, to redeem them. When you redeem a slave or when you redeem land that's been lost, it's buying it back. Redeem literally means to buy back. And the Book of Ruth is where that story is told. So I thought it really would be good for me, first of all, and then for our community, to dwell in this little book and try to hear what it might say to us as we think about our work. So the Book of Ruth has been my companion, and it's been the most amazing journey the last few years to be teaching it over and over. And as you know, with any part of scripture, but especially when you're led to one, maybe for a particular moment or purpose, it's just been amazing to unpack it.
Well, what is the key message then of the book for our times? I mean, I get the connection of the theme of redemption, but connect that to our current moment.
It begins with a catalog of calamity. So it's the story initially of a woman named Naomi and all that happens around her and to her, beginning in the first words of the Book of Ruth, in the days when the judges ruled. And our Christian Bible places Ruth right after the Book of Judges because that's how it kind of locates itself with its own introduction. So the moment you read that, first of all, you're in a time of political crisis. Israel entered the land generations ago. Israel had the law, but Israel has had no mechanism to stay connected to the keeping of the law and even really to stay together. It's 12 tribes, plus or minus, right? And by the end of Judges, terrible things have happened. There have been these rulers, the judges themselves, Samson and Deborah and so forth, who arise and often then fall. But what they have not done is secure any kind of political, which also means because religion and politics are not disconnected in their world any more than they are in ours, they haven't prevented political, religious, civil chaos. And this reaches a climax.
Okay, this sounds familiar. You're getting familiar.
See? Right. So this is going to sound all too familiar in a way. Yeah. Although honestly, I hope our situation never gets as bad as it does by the end of Judges. The end of Judges is terrible. The texts of those last couple chapters are almost never taught on in public Christian settings because, frankly, they deal with things that you would not want children to hear about, unprepared, that actually no one even probably should read about without being prepared in some ways, because it involves a terrible violation of a person known to us, a woman known to us only as the Bethlehemite, who it's terrible. I mean, I hate to even summarize it, but let's just say that what happens to her and her common law husband essentially leads to a civil war within Israel that pits one tribe against all the others. That tribe is basically wiped out. Then that tribe needs wives, and so they go, there's one tribe that hasn't fought, and so they go like confiscate all the young women of the tribe that didn't fight and give them as wives. It's horrible. It's like exploitation in every possible dimension. And this is Israel. This is God's chosen people, right? So in one of the things that really got me thinking about the Book of Ruth, and by the way, I got this from a really beautiful essay called Boys Will Be Boaz. Oh. And as we're talking, I can't remember the author's name, but she wrote this wonderful essay, and we can link to it. She points out that this story begins in Bethlehem, which becomes important later on. And Bethlehem is the way we know the name or the identity, let's say, of the person, the woman who was violated and murdered at the kind of climax, or at the terrible climax of the Book of Judges. And so Bethlehem also, the fact that Ruth is set in Bethlehem, if you've read the last few chapters of Judges, the moment you hear the name of that town, a shiver goes down your spine. Because that's, instead of identifying the victim by her name, perhaps indeed to preserve some of her dignity, she's known only by her hometown, but it's Bethlehem. So all this has happened. These people are living in terrible times, and then a famine occurs, and there's not enough food. And so this one man named Elimelech, who's married to Naomi, takes her and their sons and leaves and goes to Moab. So now you start to like catalog this. You've got political and civil and religious disorder. You've got incredible violation between men and women, and just total violation of that most basic of human bonds that was meant to be. Now you've got natural disaster. Then they go to their neighboring country, which is the deepest enemy Israel has in its neighborhood. Moab is kind of the byword for the enemies of Israel. And so now you've got emigration, kind of probably, in a sense, unwilling but necessary to flee, desperate need. Well, then they get there, and people who've read the Bible know all this, but just when you think about how these things stack up, then Elimelech dies. The man who brought his family there dies. And then 10 years later, his two sons, who have in the meantime married Moabite women, die. And so it says, so the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. And at this point, Naomi, who has no other direct family, so in a way she's an orphan, that is, her parents seem to be out of the picture. She's now a widow, and she's a foreigner, a stranger, or we could say an immigrant. She's all three of the kind of classic triptych of vulnerability in the ancient world: to be an immigrant out of your own land, not speaking your own language, a widow bereft of your husband. And this is a patriarchal world in which it matters that women have the protection of a man as a husband, and then you've lost your family. And so she decides to go back to this place that is where the famine was, where the political disorder is. The name of the worst thing that's happened in the whole history of Israel, in a way, is Bethlehem. And that's where Naomi decides she has to go back. So that's the setup. Now, I don't know, you tell me. I mean, hopefully that's worse. Hopefully that all those things together are worse than anyone hearing this podcast has had to live through. But are there not incredible parallels in different ways to the lives so many people in our world are leading, including tens of millions of people who have had to flee their homes because of violence and natural disaster and so forth? So it's this amazingly moving and tragic and also incredibly contemporary kind of scenario, even though it's in a world that's so different from our own.
Yeah. So let's start with the characters, because I think that might be a helpful way to sort of extend, okay, what might be the relevance for today? Because you've done a beautiful job in setting up that the context of the story has a lot of the same themes and conditions that we have in the recent days. So let's play this sort of story forward. And by the way, I want to say, like, one of the key ways that I've understood how to apply, like, the art form of how to apply scripture to make sense of our current world is this beautiful description by N.T. Wright, when he says that scripture is like this play, a script of a play many, many years ago. So we just know it's like a script of the past scenes, and we're supposed to master and understand the scenes that are in the past so that we can step onto the stage and enact the next chapter. So given you've set up, like, okay, the past scene feels like in some way flows into our current reality, how does this play, how do the next scenes play out in this, if we were to step onto this stage and try to enact the next chapters of this story?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to direct our attention, I think. And what we discover is, although Naomi has lost a lot, she has not lost everyone. She has two daughters-in-law, the two women who married her two sons. By the way, I left out of the catalog because I didn't notice it the first few times, but someone pointed it out. This family has also experienced infertility. Both of these sons were married for many years, and normally in that world, children follow marriage like summer follows spring. It's just to be expected. So both of those families have not had the expected children, right? So these two women, relatively young women, who are given names in the text, Ruth and Orpah, are with Naomi. And that, I think, is actually the first really striking thing. And by the way, for the first few chapters, Naomi is very verbal. That's not quite fair. She's very talkative. She talks a lot about her situation, and she talks about it in very negative terms. And she's really always complaining about, with complete justification in many ways. But we as readers see another part of the story, which is that Naomi has not been left entirely alone. Because Orpah and Ruth both love this foreign woman, right? Doesn't probably speak their native tongue. Mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law do not always have the easiest relationship then or now. And yet both of these young women, or now widows themselves, are very attached. And there's this really beautiful scene when Naomi decides to go back to her hometown of Bethlehem, or at least her husband's hometown. They walk with her out of the city, and they begin to weep at the thought of leaving each other. So the depth of love between these three women is really powerful. And I think it's even important to note that, of course, as we know, Ruth ends up going with her, but Orpah turns back, but not before there's this incredible scene of love and affection. And I don't think Orpah, this is actually, to me, a really important moment in the story for us to identify with both of the daughters-in-law. So Naomi's heading home to a land where these women have never lived, where they will be seen as outcast, strangers, enemies, indeed. I mean, think of whichever is the most disfavored group in the country you live in. When you hear someone comes from that country, and it's different in different countries, but in the US, we probably could name it. And people are like, oh, you're from there. Oh, you came illegally from there.
Right.
That they are anticipating that level of reception. Orpah hugs and kisses Naomi, weeping, actually offers to go with her. And Naomi says, no, don't go with me. What is there for you in Bethlehem? Are you going to be able to have a husband in Bethlehem? No way. And so Orpah goes back. And I think we need to really recognize Orpah does nothing wrong here. She does the ethical thing, more than the ethical thing. She loves her mother-in-law, but she's not going to do this crazy thing of leave Moab and go to a land where indeed she will have even worse prospects than her own mother-in-law. But Ruth sings this song over Naomi's objections. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God, my God. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you die, I'll be buried. And may God do, she says this kind of Hebrew euphemism, thus and so and more to me. And if anything but death parts me from you. By the way, one of Naomi's complaints, which is totally understandable, is that God has turned against her, that the Lord who brought her out of Israel has abandoned her and everything connected with her. And yet here's Ruth saying, the God that you believe has abandoned you, I'm choosing to follow. So Ruth is, I think I think we can identify with all three of these characters. And I think it's beautiful and relatively rare in the Old Testament that all three of these characters are very much on the margins of their own world. This drama is not playing out in a palace. It's not playing out among the powerful. These are all outsiders or exiles. By the way, the later rabbis are very critical of Elimelech for leaving the land. If you're an Israelite, you don't leave the land. The land was given by God to your family. So they see him as quite unfaithful. So his widow is tainted by that. So these are people who have not been religiously correct, are not in positions of power. And if we didn't have the story, we would never notice the scene of these three women at the edge of a Moabite town. And I just think it's a beautiful encouragement to anyone and everyone who's ever felt like I'm unseen. My story is insignificant. I am discarded by God. And yet it turns out there's more to the story, right? But of course, Ruth here is doing the most remarkable thing. Naomi's kind of doing the only real option she sees. Orpah takes a very reasonable decision. Ruth makes the most extraordinary decision, which is, I think, at the heart of what redemption is, which is to say, I am going to identify myself so completely with your need and your situation that I'm going to spend myself in at least just not leaving you forsaken in it. Even if I can't do anything about it, at least I'm going to be with you in it. It's an amazing, amazing commitment that Ruth makes. And so they make their way together, these two women, back to Bethlehem.
Andy, what's striking about what you're saying is that the passage opens with the end of Judges, which is this sort of calamity, like you described, at a large social scale. And
Yes,
applying
exactly.
that today, I think a lot of people can get preoccupied with the large social calamities and dislocations. And so it's like they're reading Judges is like they're reading the newspaper headlines.
Exactly. And I mean, after Ruth, we're going to get back into, in a way, geopolitics. It'll be the Book of Samuel and then the books of Kings. And, the whole Testament spends a lot of time on the big events because they shape the whole nation. But I think that this book is in here, and in the Hebrew Bible, it's placed among the writings, not in the history books. But I think it's beautiful in the Christian Bible, the way it is inserted here, as if to say, like, don't only fixate on these kind of large scale events. Turn your attention to even the smallest and the most marginal of people, because God's redemptive purpose, there's that word again, may be playing itself out, not in the palaces, not among the powerful, but among people that you might easily overlook or might never have heard of. So it's just a beautiful invitation to sort of refocus your attention. and believe that there's possibility there.
And refocus at the small scale, almost the intimate
Yes.
small scale
Yes.
you're talking about. You said it's not happening in the palaces. I think about the classic heroines that in the Old Testament that were taught to me in vacation Bible school growing up. And it's like, in my mind, I remember Deborah, because she, sort of killed an enemy king in a ghastly way through a tent peg.
Welcome to Judges.
Yeah, exactly. Or you can, fast forward to Esther. And again, it's in the palace, right? She's
in the palace.
She's an influential elite, if you will. And yet the book is called the Book of Ruth, which, as you pointed out, is this unlikely heroine who's a migrant, who's an outsider, but the one distinguishing thing is she's relationally faithful to the people that God has placed her in. So translate that for Christians today.
Wow. Yeah. I really love that phrase, relationally faithful, because it invokes what is, by the way, by far the most important word in the Book of Ruth itself. I was drawn to it by thinking about it as a story of redemption, but in the book itself, the word is this amazing Hebrew word, hesed with that kind of aspirated H, that means covenant faithfulness to another. And what the Book of Ruth is, above all, is beyond just sort of a beautiful story, but to the extent it calls to us and in a sense lays an obligation on us, you might say, it is to discern, who am I called to be this faithful to? Who am I called to go this far for in love beyond what's reasonable? Because Orpah is faithful in a reasonable way to her mother-in-law, who she no longer, because of the death of the husband, that relationship is dissolved in terms of any obligation. Orpah fulfills all obligation. Ruth goes beyond obligation to just this incredible outpouring of relational faithfulness. I have been given you. I actually believe I've been given to you by God, and I'm going to stick with you. And I think one of the messages of the Book of Ruth, and almost everyone listening to this will have at least some inkling of how it all turns out, right, is that those acts of hesed can be, and maybe in some sense always will be, supremely significant when the whole story is told. And even though it's very small and not geopolitically relevant in Ruth 1, these acts of relational faithfulness are what changed the shape of the story, ultimately for generations to come. And by the end of the Book of Ruth, that is very much in view, even before we find out really that these are the ancestors of King David, which is a big part of why it's in the Bible, of course. But it starts way before anyone can anticipate, the long-term implications. It just starts with this act of radical covenant faithfulness. I'm going to go with you. What is yours is mine. Su casa mi casa, right? You're like, I'm in it with you. Yeah. So maybe we should get to the next character. There's obviously another important character here, as they get back to Bethlehem, and they do have a distant relative, a kinsman. And this gets us to this really important phrase that is the redemption idea in this book and in the Hebrew Bible, of the goel, which is a Hebrew word that's usually translated that the kinsman redeemer. There's this provision in the law, because lives were unpredictable and sometimes short in that world, even more so than in our modern world, that if a man does die, that his nearest male relative is expected to marry the widow to keep the family line together and to provide for that woman and for children and posterity, really. And there's lots of twists and turns in this story, and it gets very soap opera-ish on the threshing floor at about midnight one night. But in essence, what happens is so now we switch registers, by the way, because now we're back in Bethlehem. We're back in the land. We have this landowner, Boaz. He's like all men of his time, basically an agriculturalist. He's a farmer, operating a fairly large farming operation. He's relatively prosperous for his time. I don't think we should over-exaggerate this. I mean, this is a small town. It's probably not, he's not rich in the way we'd probably think of, but he's got property. He has position. He's well regarded. He's seen in the town as an honorable person. For some reason, real mystery. He's not married, which most men of his situation would be. So we don't really know why that is the case, but that leaves for an interesting opening. And he observes Ruth's hesed. He notices her faithfulness to her mother-in-law. And of course, it's a very striking story that this Moabite woman is suddenly in town with Naomi, and everyone's talking about it. He gets to know her. He begins to greatly admire her. She also sees how admirable he is. By the way, when she shows up in his field, one of the first things he says to her is, he says, "Stay in this field because I've told the young men not to bother you." Yeah. Now, you have to have ringing in your ears the absolute violation of proper relationships between men and women that's echoing from the Book of Judges and that is endemic in this world at this time, that an unattached woman, especially a foreigner, out in a big field with lots of tall crops around, is incredibly vulnerable. And Boaz, without any prompting, just lays down kind of the ethical guidelines and says, "I've told the young men not to bother you." And everyone knows what he means by that. So he's a person of great integrity, a person of great forethought, and he's creating, in the midst of this general situation of disorder, an environment in his field where people are treated with honor, which I think is quite remarkable. And here's another point for us to pause on, which is, in a way, whatever's happening around us, what can we do to make sure that, in a sense, in our field, in the domains in which we have authority, the vulnerable are protected proactively. They don't have to ask for it. They don't have to get a lawyer. We're just doing what we need to do so that if you're vulnerable in any setting where I have an agency, that I'm actually making it safe for you. And Boaz is that kind of person. So I think it's worth introducing the final character that no one will even think of because he's so briefly mentioned. It turns out, so Boaz and Ruth, they fall in love basically. And she also very boldly goes to him in this crazy scene in the middle of the night. And basically she does plead for his full protection in marriage, to redeem, to buy back through marriage the lost land and lineage of her father-in-law, her dead father-in-law, Elimelech. But it turns out that actually Boaz is not the one with the legal obligation to do this. So there's another guy who's a nearer relative. We don't ever learn his name because he shows up and then he departs from the scene very quickly. But I actually love this parallel. So back in Moab, there were these two people, Orpah and Ruth. Orpah has kind of fulfills the ethical obligation and then goes home. Ruth just pours herself into love of Naomi. Well, now we've got Boaz and this unnamed guy who Boaz goes to meet at the gate the next morning to sort of negotiate who's going to marry and into the family of Elimelech. And this guy behaves perfectly ethically. Actually, when he's offered to buy the field, he's like, "Oh, that's great, I'll buy the field." And then Boaz says, "Well, actually, there's a daughter-in-law that comes with the field that you'll need to marry, the Moabite, Ruth." And then the guy's like, "I do not want to get involved in a cross-cultural marriage, And so Boaz sets it up very well so that Boaz is going to end up with the opportunity and the chance to do that redemptive act. But I love that there's this other guy who he doesn't do anything wrong. He negotiates appropriately, and he just passes off this stage of history. And Boaz is the one that is the hero, along with Ruth, the heroine, if you will, because both Boaz and Ruth go above and beyond what's required. There's no ethical obligation for Boaz to step into this situation. He does it really just out of sheer love. And the result of his love is hesed, is further covenant faithfulness to Ruth and to Naomi. And now, there's so much to say about the story. Now we have such an interesting tableau in a way, because we have a total outsider, Ruth, who's played a redemptive role, and very much an insider, a male landowner named Boaz. Now we have a person structurally out of power, a person structurally in power, but both of them making these radical choices out of love towards hesed that together add up to a story of redemption. And sometimes, unfortunately, because of the Goel connection, the Book of Ruth is taught as a story of Boaz the Redeemer. But first of all, he's not legally. And second, there's another person, Ruth, who has behaved just as redemptively, just as sacrificially. And I really see this as the story of two redeemers, Ruth and Boaz. And it also says, where are you in your world? Are you a total outsider? You can act redemptively. Are you an insider with a lot of agency and ethical authority? You can act redemptively. But for both, it's going to be this kind of extraordinary outpouring that goes beyond just what's required by the ethics of your situation.
If we think of this moment as somewhat analogous to Judges, which leads to Ruth, which is a moment of chaos, disintegration, and uncertainty. And I really loved how you said that, Ruth is a story of an outsider, Boaz is a story of an insider. What's interesting, it certainly is, I can imagine our listeners saying, am I, more like Boaz or more like Ruth? And, if I were to guess, I would imagine most of our listeners would probably gravitate towards more like Boaz. If you were listening to this podcast, maybe you are, but there's probably, less chance that socially speaking, in social structures, you are an outsider. But I think the character of Ruth, though, is still obviously really important for everyone. And I think of that in terms of what we talked about before, in terms of a picture as relational faithfulness at an intimate level. That I think applies to everyone, right? We all have relationships in our intimate circles. I want to ask you to talk about the challenges in our modern society to that kind of relational faithfulness. Like I was thinking about, my favorite passage, I think it is for many people, when Ruth does sing, for where you go, I will go, where you lodge, I will lodge. And I just thought, that is actually so rare. I mean, maybe with nuclear family, we have that kind of commitment. But beyond that, it's really hard to see a lot of examples of that kind of depth of commitment. Normally it's sort of like, for where my career goes, there I will go. For where housing is affordable, there I will buy a house.
Wow. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, and there's this phrase that's, I feel regrettably common. Unfortunately, we've talked about recently, we sometimes hear it at Praxis when people are part of the Praxis community. People talk about their tribe. They say, I've found my tribe. I mean, someone might say, good faith listeners are my tribe. And it's become a common way in certain cultural circles of saying my people. And Ruth says, your people who are not her tribe, like no way is, and the antipathy goes both directions between Moab and Israel. And yet here's Ruth saying, your tribe, my tribe, not as in I've found my natural affinity group, but I'm going to reach out beyond what would be natural. And it is really significant. As you say, this is, there is an element of family here, of course. This is a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, but the husband is gone. It was always a cross-cultural marriage, we might presume, with all the communication challenges that come with that. And they're not blood relatives. And I actually think it's very important to not let the kind of love story, which leads to a marriage and a child in Ruth, which is wonderful, become our only template of what kind of covenant faithfulness is. Because this story that comes first, and you don't get the marriage without first this other thing,
right,
is of these two unrelated people who really have no further reason to have anything to do with each other, though they have been bound together for a time. And it's this doubling down on connection and proximity and presence. So it is a really good question what this means for us, because our world is so different. It's highly mobile. Not as mobile, I think, as sometimes we think it is. Americans move less and less each year, actually, since the 1960s. So if we're talking about a U.S. context, people actually are not as mobile as they were in the couple of decades after the Second World War. But there's still, I think there's it could be that the spiritual mobility of our world has continued to increase even as the sheer kind of numbers of people moving house has sort of tailed off, because there is such a sense of optionality in all relationships in our culture. I and you are Gen X, so we did not have to live with this thing called ghosting. But, like the fact that people just literally just stop responding to each other when they decide for inscrutable reasons, like, well, you're no longer my top priority, and I don't want to go through the kind of awkwardness of telling you that. So I just stop responding. Or we say we'll get together and I just don't show up, and then I don't answer your text. Like, this is probably everyone under the age of 30 has experienced this in real time. So there's this kind of spiritual mobility, or a spirit of mobility, a dark spirit of optionality, that I can leave you anytime I want. And here's this invitation to go the other direction and just decide. And you can't do this with everyone. And Ruth, in committing to Naomi, is saying no, presumably to some kin back at home, certainly to the possibility of marrying someone of her own tribe and forming a new family, which is what Naomi thinks she should do. So you can't do it with everyone, but you do have to discern, like, where am I called to just be radically, inexplicably committed to the good of this other person.
I think that there's actually a special invitation in our culture that maybe can redeem the mobility thing, because it strikes me when and again, we're describing our generation, our age, as hitting empty nest. And when you hit empty nest, your kids go where their career goes often, and where the housing values are affordable and so forth. And that's sad. But it does open up a possibility of welcoming new people into that space, right? Like Jody and I are thinking about this, and thinking about a friend, longtime friend in particular, who's been going through some real health challenges. And we've been thinking, by ourselves, our lives can feel a little small. Like, we cooked at the end of the workday, we cook dinner, we watch some show, but it's very contained. And as I hear you expound on Ruth, there's an invitation to open up those relational circles in a way that, Ruth demonstrates, right? It's not just my people or my relationships that I'm going to commit to. And I just wonder if our generation has a special invitation to think more creatively about the empty nest stage.
I think that's beautiful. Catherine and I think it's fair to say we don't in the most natural way have the gift of hospitality. It's not like the thing, like some people just love to throw parties and that kind of thing. And that's not exactly us. But we have felt recently to make it a kind of clear commitment. This may sound, to some people who are extroverts, this will sound ridiculous, but just trust me that it's a big deal for us. That every week we want to be inviting someone into our home that we can just serve and extend hospitality to. And, this is in the context that I travel almost every week. Part of the week I'm away. Catherine has a very complex, demanding job. But for us, that was a meaningful way of saying, we don't want this home to be just a place of leisure and quiet now that the kids are gone, but that we want to be kind of continually re-extending ourselves to people we do feel called to serve in some way. So but I think, that's like entry level, and what you all are considering is more than that. And probably all of us should be considering more than that.
Well, whatever way we are, I think the question that Ruth is posing is, who can I redeem? Who can I buy back from a condition of dislocation, of isolation, and so forth? And we all have some opportunity to redeem somebody. Andy, we've been talking about relational practices. I want to close with some institutional practices. It's just a theme we often cover here. And I want to talk about two relational practices, the Redeemer kinsman practice and the law of gleanings, because both of those are institutional practices that feature heavily in the story. So I want to ask you if you can expound briefly on what they are, what they are in the historical moment, the Old Testament, but then really explain how can we creatively play the next scene of these institutional practices of the Redeemer kinsman and the law of gleanings.
Wow. Well, gleaning, I think I'm clearer on, so I'll start with that one. This
Okay.
is, of course, the practice of leaving part of your field unharvested so that those who don't have land can have the dignity of meaningful work and harvest food to provide. In Ruth's case, she harvests barley initially for herself and her mother because Boaz observes this part of the law. And again, think about how unlikely it is that most landowners in Israel at this time are observing this rather obscure command in the law. But it had a very profound point, which is it's that people don't need charity; they need the dignity of meaningful work. And in Israel, to be poor is to not have land. Those two things in this time, in the time of the Book of Ruth, if you are poor, what that means is your family has lost through some calamity the ancestral land that you would have been able to work and reap the agricultural fruits of. But for us today, I think this is such a profound invitation, so profound that at Praxis, we make this part of our rule of life, that we ask everyone to think about what is some aspect of your work that gives you provision and status and recognition and a kind of power that you can leave undone so that people with less opportunity or status or power than you may have the opportunity to do it themselves. This can happen inside, we work with organizations, it can happen inside organizations when a CEO, for example, is invited to have the spotlight or go to some event and speak. And that CEO says, oh, actually, I want to send this other person from my team who you might not have heard of, but trust me, they're great and they know our work really well. And you allow this other person to kind of take the spotlight, you might say. But there's many forms this can take. And I think we've all got to be asking, like, everything in our world, along with mobility, like the other word that would be like the spirit of the ages, the spirit of maximization, right? Like maximize your influence, maximize your platform. And how can we take these things that we could max out for our own benefit and actually put a boundary around how much we're taking from it and then create space for other people? When I was active on social media, I'm very vestigial on social media now, but I tracked, I tried to have like a 3-to-1 or more ratio of promoting other people's things through my social media account to anything I was doing, which frankly is not that hard. Other people are doing better and more interesting things than I am. But a lot of people, their social media, depending on which platform they're on, is a lot about them. But why not use that, whatever space you've been given, to actually create room for other people? I do this with book endorsements too. There's this crazy thing you and I know, a lot of people know about endorsing books. I do not endorse books by people like me who have published multiple books, who are in the middle of their career. The only books I endorse are by unknown authors who I think have done something beautiful and amazing, and I want the world to know. And that's one little like practice of gleaning in my own kind of professional life. So yes, kinsman redeemer. Gosh, I've never thought about this, Curtis. You may have it. You may have an answer in mind. I mean, so this is the idea. You're responsible for people you might not think matter anymore. I mean, that would be the generalizable form. In other words, your brother. This is in the original setting. Your brother married someone.
Yeah.
Your brother's now dead. That person was never anything more than an in-law to you. And yet you are all actually called, if you're the nearest kin, to set aside all your own interests and take up the interests of this family. What is the kind of institutional version of that, or the way we would replicate that now? Gosh, I have not actually thought about that question.
Well, I'll add that to your list of things to think about as you keep pondering this text, because I was wondering that myself, because it's such a foreign concept for this day and age. And yet I think there's something there to that, right? Because if Ruth is all about expanding our circles of faithfulness, Redeemer Kinsman is exactly that. It is saying we are responsible for redeeming people that we naturally don't think of redeeming.
And it has to have something to do with assuming the liabilities of others that we wouldn't have to assume.
Yeah.
Because in the ancient world, it would have involved debt. It would have.
I mean, what I think about are, old people with dementia, people that right now we normally say they're taken care of because they're put away in another institution, and yet the Redeemer kinsman says, no, you're still responsible for them.
Yeah.
You're still,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yes.
That's one thought I had.
Well, I've certainly seen, I mean, our families, by the grace of God, are intact, but I certainly see this in my mother has dementia. It's not as terrible as it can be, but it's very limiting. And certainly seeing my own wife as the daughter-in-law, the degree of sacrifice my wife has made to care for my own mother has been incredible.
I have a good friend who spent several years caring for their in-law with the same condition, and I always found it very moving, precisely because I think that's what is being described in this Redeemer kinsman institution, and it is a kind of care that no matter what, no government institution is going to replicate, right? That kind of personal attention and care.
Completely. And this is why I think Boaz is moved to step in, because he doesn't even have the legal or ethical obligation, but to step in is even so powerful. Is he's not just fulfilling kind of the letter of the law. He's taking on the burdens of this whole family, and in doing so, opening up incredible possibility. Because of course, the end of this book is the birth of a child. And can I say one more thing about how it ends? Yeah. Because you said institution. So when I think institution, I think lasting patterns. Right. They say, may this child and the house that comes out of this child be like the house of Perez, who built, and so they refer back to Boaz's great-great-great-grandfather. Now, Perez is a weird person to bring up because Perez is the son of Tamar and Judah, which is another extremely icky story like all these stories that are not in the Jesus Storybook Bible for kids they all come together in the Book of Ruth. And what happens is, they all get redeemed. So this story of a completely broken relationship between a guy who's not willing to keep his covenant responsibilities and a woman who has to essentially act very manipulatively, but is judged righteous because she got what was rightly hers. But story of total brokenness. Now they say, may this house be like the house of the son who came out of that, which is to say, Ruth and Boaz have restored a pattern of men and women relating honorably to one another that had been broken generations ago and has been broken up to that moment. But they've now reintroduced into the story of Israel the possibility that men and women can relate in true honoring of one another. Then we go on, right, to the David story and the kings, but of course, eventually to their great-great-great-great-grandson, who is Jesus, the great Redeemer. And all of it happens because these two individuals, Ruth and Boaz, separately and together, live out just in their own relationship something that kind of restores the possibility of God's way in the world. So we should never underestimate the long-term results that can come from our breaking previous patterns of violation and sin, and then setting in motion new patterns, new stories that Obed's going to tell his son Jesse, Jesse's going to tell his son David. The succeeding generations won't always live them all out perfectly, but it sets in motion something new in history, and then you and I get to tell the story and change our lives because of it. So I think we should all hope for that from our own stories.
That's a beautiful conclusion, Andy. Thank you so much for coming on our podcast, for expounding, exegeting, teaching, exhorting on this book that I think many of us don't really kind of dive deeply into, other than the kind of, sentimental passage of Ruth. But it is clearly, there's a lot of richness here that's relevant, broadly speaking, to this social moment. So Andy, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right, friends, thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed this conversation with Andy. And next week, we will be back again around the campfire.